Guys, it is December the 16th, 2025. We're looking at a map from the Middle East. You can see Turkey, Syria, you got Bulgaria, Romania, all of this ties together. Jordan, Israel's here, Lebanon. Syria has been very active. We just lost 2 troops over there. But what I want to talk about is Turkey, because when you talk about Turkey, you got to remember where was, and really it's the cradle of civilization as we know it. A lot of things happened in Turkey, guys. Let me pull this up, including if you read the book of Revelations. I did a special on that a couple of years ago, and that all 7 churches in the early books of Revelation are in Turkey. Now, that's amazing. We've been seeing a lot of sites that have been discovered, Göbekli Tepe, a few others like that, guys, that we didn't even know they existed until in the 70s. They started getting discovered. And remember, Göbekli Tepe it would hold 20,000 people. And I did one show about that, or one video about that, showing that the god of that area, which would have been that would be the head god of Samaria and Babylon. Again, this is in the beginning of this earth age. And that will be in a different video, guys. It may be part of this series. We'll just see. But what they've done, there's a city in Turkey called Harran, Harran, and it's on the border with Syria. And you see this large green area right here. It's a very fertile type valley, kind of a big rectangle. Harran is right here. It's always been there. This is where Abraham came to retire. His father was from there. It's been around for a long time. Again, in this desert, it makes sense that it would have been there a long time if you just notice that it's a very fertile looking area right in the Syrian borders right here. And up north of here is Göbekli Tepe. And all of this ties in together because something, if you remember the video I talked about, to where the Sumerians were told by their god, and I think there were lesser gods all around the planet. We have one main Father in heaven. We have Jesus Christ, our Savior. But each nation and civilization had their own gods. And it's written about in history. It's on stone columns, all of the above. Now, why am I going here? It's because there's a very big interest in Atlas 3I, or 3I Atlas, any way you want to say it. My husky says yes. Anyway, that image that I keep showing that shows multiple craft within that group of craft has a lot of meaning. Now, whether or not we see anything happen from that in the next year or two, we don't know. But it piqued my interest on something that I mentioned probably the middle of the year. I may have done a video on it. I said, where did all the gods go? And I mentioned that, you had the gods of Rome and Greece, and you had the Syrian gods, you had the Egyptian gods, and you had the Sumerian or Anunnaki gods, guys. And all of that's written. And so where did the gods go? Now, what's the reason I brought up Haran here? Again, it's the land of Abraham and his father, who was a priest also. Is now you can go there, you can see the ruins of the city, the very center sections of it. Very beautiful place. A lot of it's torn down, but they found 2 columns standing in this area that were carved. And it goes back to where the carvings go into the Anunnaki kingdom. It's very old. A lot of the people that came into ruins that had been there for thousands of years. Anyway, just like in South America, the Aztecs and the Mayans, all that group, found civilizations. They didn't build them. They'll tell you that. Anyway, in this group of temples, and you can get it, I've got some pictures of it, they found 2 temples still standing. And what it says basically is that the daughter of Enlil and her son, each one of them had inscriptions called stelae at the top of the columns. And they found them. I've got pictures of them, and let me read to you what they found on these columns. And if you were standing on the ground, as I just showed you that satellite map image, this is what it would look like. There was a lot of devastation there, but these two columns with at the top, the inscriptions at the top, again from the sister of Enlil and her son, I think I got that right, is a message. And this is very, very old. This is older than the Turkey that we know. This goes back to ancient Babylon. Again, where did the gods go? Let's read what was taken from those temple inscriptions. Now, what had happened, the gods had grown angry with the people. It said it was in the 16th year of Nabopolassar. And guys, they were, again, just like the scribes, these people were trained, and what they would do, they wrote down everything, the exact date, the time, the situation, the seasons, everything was recorded. That's how they were trained, even up to this day, the good ones. But it says here on the top of these columns, it was in the 16th year of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. When it says sin here, but it's spelled S-U-E-N, and it's a short for two words, and it's pronounced Suin, not sin. He was Lord of the gods. And now we're talking about possibly because we're dealing with the Babylonian gods, right? He became angry with the city and his temple. Let me say this. This could be either Enlil or Enki or in that group too, because they had control over areas. Anyway, it says, he became angry with the city and his temple, and he went up into heaven, and the city and the people in it went to ruin. Their protection was taken away from them. In other words, each god was assigned a certain territory, or each, let's call it, I guess one technical name would be sons of God or demigods, half God, half man. But in the beginning, there was a race of people. And from there, they actually came, and they wanted to be gold miners. They had scanned, their technology was very good. They had scanned the earth. They knew where gold was, and that was important to them. That's why they initially thought they could retrieve it from the Red Sea. And when they realized that that was too difficult, they found that there was huge deposits of gold in Africa. But a great flood was coming, and it flooded those mines, and they had to move. They started, again, in certain areas, and as different events happened on the planet, they moved. The last place that we know that they mined gold was in South America, in Brazil. And there's a lot of evidence that they were there, and that gold was heavily in use, and that the structures were beyond common man, kind of like the pyramids, but different styles. Anyway, you want to know where the gods went. And what happens is it all relates back. It relates to the Bible. If you look at Ezekiel, a craft came down, it took him away. Same thing in Enoch. And here we're talking about an entire series of groups leaving. He became angry with his city and his temple, but it wasn't just Suan or Suin here. It was an entire group of his children and other groups. It was a major evacuation of the planet. Further on in the Sumerian text, it says that when this great waves were coming, that they lifted in their craft like birds. And how does that possibly relate to Atlas 3I? The fact is, I know it's craft in there. A lot of people don't agree with that. The image speaks for itself. And I've said this before too, when in prophecy, or what generation in prophecy will see the things coming back on this earth? If you don't believe it will happen, you might as well throw your Bible away, because it tells you several times from the Old Testament to the New Testament, there's a returning coming here. And this is telling us right here on these tall temples that are ancient, that The Lord of the gods became angry with his city and his temple and went up to heaven, and the city and people in it went to ruin. This goes all the way back to, comes all the way forward to the book of Revelation and the temple coming down, or the great city, which, by the way, is a pyramid. It's not a cube. If you look at the measurements very closely, it describes a pyramid, not a cube. You got to pay very close attention. I've mentioned that in a video before. Now, in history, when you're talking about Sumeria and Babylon, the captivity and all of that, the Anunnaki cannot be left out. People like to kind of separate them, but they were the original sky people that came here and changed things. I don't say there was some type of spiritual god or anything like that, or gods, plural. They were very highly advanced technically, knew how to do things because their civilization is very old and they lived very long. And they had a lot of influence on the areas of Egypt. And so many of the ruins that they find now, including the pyramids, are so much older than they say. When you say, you can't say Egypt built them. They were there before then. You can't say that in the ruins in South America. They were there before any civilizations that we know of, except for the Sumerians and the Anunnakis. It says that this departure of the Anunnaki gods from Earth was a drama-filled event. Incredibly, the departure is neither surmised nor speculative. It is amply documented. The evidence comes to us from the Near East as well as from the Americas. We're talking about South America mostly. And some of the most direct and certainly the most dramatic records of the ancient gods' departure from Earth come to us from Haran. Not Iran, but Haran. The testimony is not hearsay. It consists of eyewitness reports, among them by the prophet Ezekiel. This is also in the area where he was during the captivity and where a lot of people had been put. The reports are included in the Bible, and they were inscribed on stone columns, the text dealing with miraculous events leading to the accession to the throne of Babylon's last king, and then the departure at the top of that, guys. This is what happened. And all throughout the stories of Enlil and Enki, there were battles between them. One didn't like the overcrowding loudness of the human population that they had created. The other one wanted to save it, and that begins the story of the original flood. And more than likely that had to do not with Noah's flood, but with the flood before that, Gilgamesh and that group, guys, because, again, Africa was flooded. The mines flooded. And they had diamond mines and gold mines. Now they still have those there. But they found out on the high ridges in South America that the gold had washed, in the great flood, guys, the gold had washed through, the flood had washed through those mountains and pushed the gold down into valleys. And that's why you see that ancient architecture there along Lake Titicaca, up on the top of the hill there, and what's that called, Tiacama? Anyway, those ruins are from the Sumerian sky gods. They were there before, again, the Mayans or any of those people. Anyway, Ezekiel was there, and the reports are included in the Bible. They were inscribed on stone again, texts dealing with miraculous events leading to the accession to the throne of Babylon's last king. He was an Anunnaki, Sumerian Anunnaki. It says, in earlier days, Haran was a flourishing commercial, cultural, religious, and political center. Remember Abraham's father and Abraham himself, they were all trained religious scribes, basically. They knew how to record events. It says, so much that even the prophet Ezekiel in Ezekiel 27:24, who lived in the area with other exiles from Jerusalem, recalled her reputation as a traitor. And when he's saying her, that's the city of Haran. Again, he recalled her reputation as a traitor in blue clothes and broidered work, and in chest of rich apparel, bound with cords and made of cedar. It was a city that had been from Sumerian times on an away from Ur was the capital. It was the main thing. It was the big New York. It was the home of the high gods. They call it the cult center of the moon god Nannar-Sin, and that is the full name, but it's pronounced Suin. Anyway, Abraham's family ended up residing there because his father Terah was a Tirhu, an Oman priest, first in Nippur, then in Ur, and finally in Nannar-Suin's temple in Haran. That's Abraham's father. They were aware of all this, guys, and so many people want to separate the Old Testament from the ancient culture of Babylon in many ways. I mean, it's all written there, and I'm not saying everybody does it, but again, they don't want to include the Anunnaki because I think a lot of information like that was hidden and destroyed. We know that many expeditions came into the area. Much was hidden, places like the Smithsonian and under the Vatican. And then when it was all sorted and done, they released the books that we now call the Bible. But they had to, the reason they did it, whether you want to agree with it or not, is to make one religion dominant over all the other ones. And so the way they do it is like the cancel culture that we saw back during Trump's first time in office. They wanted to tear the statues down, get rid of the books, any information that went to the true history. They wanted it out of the way. History repeats itself, my friends. Anyway, listen to this, and it has a lot to do with the destruction of the ancient sites, even damage, including the floods on the pyramids. Again, it said that it was a city that had been from Sumerian times as an away from Ur. Cult center of the moon god, Nannar-Suin. Abraham's family ended up residing there because his father Terah was a Tirhu, an Oman priest, first in Nippur, then in Ur, and finally in Nannar-Sin's temple. So again, how can you separate Abraham, his father, from this group? You cannot. And there's history, guys, there that I don't even talk about because so many people have their blinders on so tight into focusing in one direction that they miss the overall picture. And that's a shame because Christ had it all in a very short paragraph. He said, love your Lord thy God and treat your neighbor as you would have them treat you. That's all the religion you need. The rest is history. But it says, after the demise of Sumer by the nuclear evil wind, that's what they called it because there was a battle, Nannar and his spouse, Ningal, made their home and headquarters in Haran. And so there's Ningal. She was the sister of Enlil, if I'm not mistaken. I think it is. Anyway, look it up again. She's one of the ones, her and her son, that put the inscriptions on the top of the temples in Haran that we read. But this nuclear evil wind, guys, what a lot of people, they do realize that most of the great science fiction epics came from the Old Testament. Have you ever heard of the family nuclear or the nucleonics? That was passed all the way down into the book and movie Doom. They had the family group of nuclear weapons back, and what that comes from is from the ancient Sumerian text and culture. This evil wind was a battle between Marduk and another group of these gods. Had to do with the temple and the pyramids. And that's why the desert is glass in many areas of the Middle East, especially south of Egypt, because of nuclear wars. because there was a battle of the gods, the lesser gods, but that's what was going on. And they had the technology to build these weapons. That's where people in our generation learned how to build nuclear weapons. It was passed down. And these people didn't die. They left. If you look at the kings list in Egypt, now we're dealing with the same group, the kings of Egypt, the kings of Ur, and all of that. And you're even dealing with the family of Abraham. They lived a very long life, these kings. In the kings list, 30,000 years, some of them. And that's mentioned in some of the Anunnaki books, the great lifetime that they had. Just bear with me there. I've talked about this 12 years or so ago. I did a 4 or 5 video series, maybe longer than that, in 2013 on a lot of the Sumerian text. And what I'm doing now is just an intro into going through that information and some of the newer information that's come out since then. And I'm going there because there are craft in Atlas 3I. Whether they're coming here now, we don't know that. I'm not putting a date or an event into place. What I'm doing is seeing objects in a picture that relate to what's called in the Anunnaki text the heavy lifters, as well as many other craft. And the heavy lifters were because of the gold trade. They had light craft that Ezekiel experienced, but when you're dealing with the gold, it's a very heavy weighted object. And the Sumerian text goes back to say that the planet the Anunnaki came from needed the gold because they were almost grinding it into a fine dust and putting it kind of like chemtrails into their atmosphere because it was dying, and I guess it was reflecting the heat of the sun or whatever. Anyway, that's what the gold's about. But then we find out that Mars was involved in all this too. And I did videos maybe 10 years ago where there was definitely scarrings in some of the rover shots where it looks like huge bulldozers that pushed away areas of the mountains, and what's called tailings in the mining industry were shown. They were very clear. Anyway, what the Anunnaki text talks about, the heavy lifters were only needed to get the large amounts of gold off of our planet because of the gravity. Once you got to either the moon or to Mars, you could use lighter craft because when you're knocking out a lot of the gravity, it takes a lot less to move something that heavy. And it looks like not only was Mars a relay station, it was also a mining event. Guys, I've got one picture, I think from 2005 rover, maybe 2007 anyway, of this valley that looks like it was impacted. It looks like it was a city and a mining town. That if I don't put it in this video, I'll put it in the next one. But there's a relationship of all of this. Now, how would Atlas tie in? It came from, you can't say millions of miles. It has to be billions of miles because the Earth is 93 million miles from our sun. That's just one AU. Then you go all the way out to Pluto and Uranus, and you've got millions and millions, but it's past that. But we're talking about going back a few thousand years, maybe more, probably much more, because it ends up in the time of Ezekiel when a lot of these events were happening, and in the time of Abraham and his wife Sarah. But so it was all about finding gold on this planet. And I think it had a lot to do with their interference relating to the interference that happened in the garden. It changed things. It changed people. Now they could see they were naked. Things like that. All of this relates. And when you've got what we're seeing with Atlas, again, think about it coming in billions of miles, very high speed. It comes through the planets in a counter rotation. Then it loops around the sun, bends just enough to move into the gravity of Jupiter, that field, and that would be like a long, high-speed maneuver, looping around using the gravity of the sun you needed, then the gravity of Jupiter to slow down, more than likely, the entire fleet. Now, another thing I think, because of the closer proximity, they could have very well dropped off any type of drone that would let them know in the most technical ways what was going on here. Were nuclear buttons about to be pushed? Was destruction on time? And if you maybe you haven't read yet, we'll get to it in the series, but there was the Anunnaki. Again, these were not cave people. They had a lady among them. As a matter of fact, the Hopi called her the Spider Woman, because they ended up going there into the Four Corners and leading the Hopi away from the great floods. And the Hopi have even said that they stayed down there a long time, but when they reemerged, they had changed. Anyway, she, in the Anunnaki text, traveled around the world with her group before the liftoff. They knew something was coming, and it was just like Noah was gathering the animals for that ark. She was, in her crew, she was the head doctor of science, basically. They gathered DNA from everything on the planet. Plants, animals, man. And guys, back in Genesis, on the 6th day, it says man was created, right? Well, then the 7th day we rested, or God rested, and the day with the Lord is 1,000 years. So there's 1,000 years in each one of those days. And then, here's what they don't talk about, there was an 8th day creation of man. Listen and let it sink in. A lot of you understand, but have you related it back to the manipulation of an incoming species? In other words, on the 8th day, everybody had rested, the earth had rested. 1,000 years, I guess everything was pretty cool, mellow. The seasons were nice, the earth wasn't thrown out of tilt, everything was steady. But then our Father looked and realized he needed another man. That's the 8th day creation, not Adam, but Ha-Adam, 2 different species. Now, why did, up to Noah's flood, people live so long, but we don't now? Were we 2 different species? We're dealing with, through the Roman, Greek, much of history, you're dealing with what's called demigods, or half man, half God. The gods saw a beautiful earth woman, they mated, and they had people like, in the text, Hercules, or some of the Greek gods and goddesses. Well, there was another person born from God and a beautiful earth woman. You know who he is, just for reference. Now, the head honcho of Haran that left was, again, Suin. It says, though Nanner Suin, or Sin for short in Akkadian, was not Enlil's firstborn legal heir, that rank belonged to Ninurta. He was the firstborn of Enlil and his spouse Ninlil, a firstborn on earth. They didn't originate here. We're starting to get into the firstborn. Gods and men greatly adore Nanner Suin and his spouse. The hymns in their honor in Sumer's glorious times, and the lamentations about the desolation of Sumer in general, and in particular, reveal the great love and admiration of the people for this divine couple. That many centuries later, Esarhaddon went to consult with an aging Suan leaning on a staff regarding the invasion of Egypt, and that the escaping Assyrian royals out of Syria made a last stand in Haran, served to indicate the continued important role played by Nanner Suin and Haran to the very end. And we're talking about the end of Babylon. Let's go back to Haran a minute. It says, it was in the ruins of the city's great Nanner Suin temple The Iho, notice double, that means house of double joy. The archaeologists discovered 4 stone columns called stelae that once stood in the temple, one on each corner of the main prayer hall. The inscriptions on the stelae reveal that 2 were erected by the temple's high priestess, Atagupa, and 2 by her son, Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon. They witnessed the departure. Now, talking about the science god of the Anunnaki gathering up all of the DNA before they left, why did Noah gather up all the animals before the flood? It was so he could replenish this beautiful planet that God created with the beautiful creatures that God created. Is that what is possibly happening with a craft like Atlas 3I? When they gathered the DNA, was it because they knew there was going to be years of problems, wars, rumors of wars, destruction, and that it would come a time after man gets through with his Holocaust? Remember, it's the tribulation of man, not the tribulation of God. That's the wrath of God comes after the tribulation of man. Did they prepare for these days to replenish the earth? God said we would have a new earth, right? New heaven. Do you understand where I'm going with this? It has to be a real event or it wouldn't be written. How would we know? We were told to watch the skies, that things would come. It is the glory of God to hide such a matter, but the honor of kings it is to search that matter out from high to low. Why did they say that in the Old Testament? That was the job of the watchers. But guys, this is just kind of an intro into a list of series that I think are important, kind of tying today in with history. And if you don't understand the beginning, we're not going to understand the end, and men's hearts and women's hearts will fail them because of what they see coming, because we have been manipulated, lied to, blinders put on us, and books taken and hidden from the truth. But we're going to get into things in this, like Heliopolis, the encountering the divine, Lebanon's sacred forces, the myth of the megalith, things like that. It all ties into this from the Anunnaki, Sumerian, Babylonian writings that are leading up to where we are at today. So enjoy it, guys. I hope you do. I hope you're not thrown off from it. I'm sure someone will complain that I'm talking about other gods. That's not what I said. I said we have our Father in heaven. Everything else comes under that, except for one exception, and that is Emmanuel, our Father with us. So heads up, guys. Be very safe.